I'm going to invite Umesh, Sachdev, CEO and co-founder of Uniphore, and Nirav Patel, President and CEO of Bristlecone, and Rohit Choudhary from Actual Data, led by Anil Advani. This is about startups and what they've done to take these companies to a larger scale. So please join us here on the board.
Great. So thank you everyone for joining. You should have read the agenda already, so you know who the panelists are, and I'll let them make quick introductions after I also introduce the substance and the topic for the panel. Let's just start with a raise of hands. How many of you have not been involved in Indian startups in some form or the other, either as investors or founders or advisors, mentors? Fantastic. So we've got two of you, two targets for today. By the end of the night, we hope to get you involved in some form or the other. We're looking forward to that. Let me introduce myself. I'm Anil Advani, and I'm part of USISPF. For the others who've been involved, you probably know already what's happening in India in the startup ecosystem is really crazy. It's crazy and it's hot, and I made this up, but it's crazy hot. There's a lot happening, and the question is, how we in Silicon Valley, particularly in the US, I should say, but I'll focus on more Silicon Valley, because that's really where the heart of the Indian entrepreneur sort of society ecosystem is, how we can participate in what's happening in India. And Mukesh and Gaurav, in their wisdom, they decided to create a Startup Connect program within USISPF. And in their wisdom, again, they decided to host it in Silicon Valley. And they also got a leader like John to join us and lead the program, along with other leaders, entrepreneurs. We're now 13 of us, I just learned.
That's right.
We were 4 when we started, and now we are 13 already in less than, 1 year? So clearly we're doing something right. And again, we're also looking for you guys to come and join us or help us build the program. We have one single purpose, which is to accelerate the growth of the ecosystem and the partnership between what's happening in India and what's happening in Silicon Valley. What's happened in the last 20 years, I've been in Silicon Valley. I was leading the India practice. I was the one brown lawyer at Cooley and then Auric, and I was always the head of India practice. So what I've seen the last 22 years in Silicon Valley is many of the successful entrepreneurs, either for personal reasons or in the last downturn in 2009, they decide to go back to India for various reasons. They either joined Googles and Facebooks and Apples, learn more about bigger technologies, global technologies, or started their own. But in some way or form, their life was always connected. Either their life, their minds, their hearts, and their body is always connected to Silicon Valley. You run into University Avenue, there's always somebody you run into who's been from Bangalore visiting. So that's what's happened, right? I mean, a lot of people from here, successful entrepreneurs or people with lots of experience, expertise, moved back, started their companies. Once they did that, they were still connected to Silicon Valley, and then they started participating. And obviously, again, the other way to participate is they started building companies here, raising money from US. And that's been a large part of my practice personally, representing those companies as they're setting up in the US and build global businesses here. And when we decided to start the startup panel, Startup Connect program at USISPF, as I was saying, we had one single goal, and we have one single goal, which is to accelerate the connection between Silicon Valley and what's happening in India. And whatever we can do to facilitate on both sides of it. And Mukesh and others in Washington, D.C. are doing it with policy making, helping on policy, taxes, immigration, and we're doing a lot of research and presenting to the governments in both US and India, by the way. And we're helping on setting policies which will accelerate the progress and the connection between India and US and what's happening, especially people to people. Entrepreneurs in India, how they can come in and set up businesses and more easily, and investors in the US, how they can participate in what's happening in India. So that's the single purpose for our startup. And Mukesh, maybe if you have any other thoughts, otherwise, hopefully I'm getting it exact. Okay, perfect. Just want to make sure I'm not, if there's anything else I'm missing. So, which is why we are here. If you are here and if you're in any form connected to startups or entrepreneurship or investments and interested in India, we would sort of invite you to talk to us and see if you'd like to be a member of our incredible sort of panel of founders and entrepreneurs. With that, I'm going to turn the discussion over from my right, Rohit, Nirav, and Umesh, and talk about very quickly about what you've been doing. Each of you have made the personal journey from India to Silicon Valley, building large businesses here. So please talk about that, and then we'll go into a nice sort of discussion about what others here can learn and sort of how they can be encouraged to participate with us.
Sure. So my name is Rohit. I'm the founder and CEO at Excel Data. My startup journey is, based on where you index the time from, either 2008 or 2018. So 2018 was when I started Excel Data, and 2008 was when I started working at an incredible startup in India, which is called InMobi. The commonality between these two is that, it was always built by engineers in India, but the GTM has always been focused in the US. So, I've been working in and out of startups for about 15 years, and, the last 4 years that we've been developing Excel Data, it's been an incredible journey. We essentially build monitoring and observability solutions for data-intensive applications, and which is, going to be used by everybody who is in the G2K, especially, Fortune 500 customers like Visa, Dun & Bradstreet, Verisk. Many of these companies are customers of ours. About 175 people right now, across India, Singapore, and US. I'd love to talk more about as we go along in this panel.
Before we go to Nirav, I mean, you mentioned InMobi. I always like to bring that as an example. It's a great company. I respect, what they've done, but also what they could also have done if they had started in the US early on. And I actually met the founding team very early on, made a presentation to the board about reincorporating, flipping, structuring it as a US global company from day one. And I would say they missed the boat in some respects. They could have been a much larger company than they are today. And the theme of this discussion also is to, how, if you are working with entrepreneurs in India, how you should be thinking about, especially for entrepreneurs, founders, companies that are setting up and have global ambitions, customers, enterprise customers across the world. Setting up in the US from early on is really something for you to consider and advise the people you're working with. So InMobi is a good example of, and it's a great example of a successful company to be sure, but also how much bigger they could have been if they had started with that model.
Yeah, I mean, the model that was applied at InMobi was, I think, Ram Shriram wrote the first check along with Kleiner, way back in 2008, and it was a big deal, especially in a segment which was unknown, mobile advertising. Mm-hmm. But I think, people like Ram had the foresight to invest in companies such as InMobi, and that too so early in the journey. I think it would have certainly been a different outcome, or would have become much larger if one of the founders were in the US at that point in time. And I think it makes a critical amount of difference when you're facing customers day in, day out, iterating over the product, the GTM, and everything else right from the beginning. So it's useful to have that identification pretty early in the journey. Dave is here, from Lightspeed. He and I had this discussion, and we were very clear that this is a GTM, US GTM, and one of the founders will have to move to the US. Great. Fairly straightforward discussion for us at Excel Data.
Fantastic. Nirav, your experiences?
Yeah, hi. I'm Nirav, President and CEO of Bristlecone. We are one of the modern supply chain technology services firm, part of the $19 billion Mahindra Group. My personal journey, I spent over 19 years with building Cognizant, early days, stepping that up as a technology services firm for the last couple of years. We are headquartered here in San Jose in Bristlecone. I've had multiple stints living with family in India as well as in the US. But we are at a pretty interesting juncture as from a business standpoint. We are focused on supply chain tech, over 2,600 people, 14 hubs worldwide. Front center issue in terms of the post-COVID situation. So it's very exciting to see how the Indian ecosystem continues to develop from a startup standpoint. At the same time, this is probably the first time where I see that the innovation in this space is both software as well as services is for the first time coming together in trying to solve some front center issues for our largest CEO clients. So pretty excited to be here. Look forward to engaging further on the discussion.
Umesh?
Hi everyone, Umesh Sachdev. I'm founder CEO of Uniphore. This is a company in the conversational AI space. I founded this in 2008 in India. This was a university incubation, one of the IITs. I personally moved to the US in Silicon Valley in 2018, and we shifted the headquarters from Chennai to Palo Alto. So I've had a very interesting set of learnings and journey in the last few years. You'll have to be careful in asking me questions. One of my board members, John, is sitting here, so I don't want to be overstepping some of my boundaries. But the last few years have been very exciting. We recently raised a round of financing at $2.5 billion of valuation. Today, Forbes came out with a list of AI 50, the top 50 AI companies in the US. Uniphore is the highest funded company in that list. So we've got something going. We've got the fuel in the tank. We've got the products. We're doing well. We're global. About 800 people, 300 in the US, 350 in India, and then spread around. I also partnered with Mukesh and Gaurav 2 years ago to conceptualize and create the Startup Connect program. Because for entrepreneurs like myself, founding the company in India in B2B SaaS, and then finding big markets in the US like Rohit and many others in the room, there has not been a better moment than now to foster the partnership. The countries are coming together in a very special way. Geopolitics is bringing the countries together, common values. But the startup ecosystems, the number 1 in the world and the number 3 in the world, are both fired up like there's no tomorrow. And so that's why, for us in the USISPF startup ecosystem, getting together, writing the playbook for the next generation of the next 500 founders of SaaS companies in India who might find markets in the US, reading that playbook and accelerating that journey is truly important.
Thanks for sharing, Umesh, and it's great to be working with you in this great initiative. Let's talk about that, right? I mean, it took you 8 years, or 10 years, I guess, 2008 to, if I got my math right.
That's right.
10 years to transition into a real US company, US facing. What was the biggest challenge, and for people as you advise other entrepreneurs, what was the biggest challenge in building your brand for customers here to recognize you as a leader in your space? What were the challenges and how did you overcome those?
Well, first, in hindsight, if you were to ask me what would I change in that,
yes,
I would have made the transition much sooner than I did. I got that advice from my early investors, from board members. It was very clear that our market, the larger market, was North America. And I hesitated for several reasons. One of the things that we realized early, that North America, unlike any other market in the world, is one where you have to invest or be ready to invest in your brand quite early for customers to start feeling the trust, et cetera. And this is a market where you build it and you find ways for the customers to come to you. Mm-hmm. And this is also a market where the founder CEO is so important for the leader of the company to be here if you're making this the #1 market globally. Because the product market fit has to be readjusted. It's one thing to succeed in India, one thing to succeed in Southeast Asia. And even if you're the leader in that part of the world, to come to North America where it's a mature technology market, it's very competitive. And so for all companies from South Asia, India, to come to the US, product market fit has to be reestablished. And that's the job of the founder CEO. So that's one of the reasons I took longer, because it had to be me. But to your point, what did it take to establish a brand? We were deliberate. We moved the headquarters here right after raising our Series B round. So we had fresh capital available. We had a major investor like John who had come in, and that was, I was, the proxy brand for Uniphore became John Chambers' investment, the IIT alumni ecosystem, etc. Anything that could give us credibility. And then I invested quite early to create a very solid leadership team, probably over-invested compared relative to my size of startups. And as those leaders came in, we were able to get out in front of our customers, the market, and convey, probably punch above our weight. We were conveying a size which was bigger than ours. And in our business, we are a large enterprise-focused sales machine. And for large enterprise to trust a young startup, especially one that has just moved from India to the US, all of the elements, does it have a team? Does it have the right backing? Does it have the right testimonials and credentials? And of course, the product has to be good. So all of those things had to come together. I also realized that the counter for expenses start running very fast. Mm-hmm. Once you move your headquarters from India to the US.
Don't talk about legal fees. There's lots of others. So
of course, the lawyers are very cheap in India, not so in the US. And so within 6 months of me moving to the US, I found myself raising my Series C round, whereas I thought I had a longer runway. And again, finding a major investor like Marsh Capital, mm-hmm, who led our $50 million C round very quickly, again, lent that brand and things like that. So it's a series of steps that the founder CEO moving here, reestablishing product market fit, having enough fuel in the tank to build a good, solid leadership team that conveys the confidence to the market, and then making sure you have enough fuel in the tank to step up from there.
Great. Rohit, let's talk about your personal journey. I know you started during the COVID. I mean, started in the sense of making the move. We had lots of conversations over lots of coffees and all sorts of conversations that we probably don't want to divulge here. But talk about your personal journey, and also as you are sort of chasing Umesh, you're hot on his trail in terms of the growth. What are the lessons that are you guys discussing, especially as Umesh mentioned, building a leadership team here? That's certainly something on the agenda for you, building a senior leadership. How are you sort of interacting among the founders here? How are they helpful? How else can they help? How can you sort of contribute back? Everything, all of that. Share your thoughts.
Yeah, so plenty of questions, but let me start with the journey. So we raised a seed with Lightspeed Emergent and Lightspeed US. And this was, even before I quit my job, they was very gracious to write us a term sheet and say, the day that you feel like starting the company, go ahead and do that. And this was coming on the back of, working for about 4 years at Hortonworks, which itself was an incredible company. It went to from 0 to $100 million in ARR in about 3.5 years. So the sort of, benchmark in our heads was already set that, this is how quickly you can grow if you have the right set of product. The difference was that, Hortonworks was built on the back of 10 years of open source development, and what they were at that point trying to do was to monetize that. So we looked at, what kind of model, we want to implement in our company. Is it going to be an open source company? Is it going to be a closed source commercial company? And many of those aspects. So those GTM decisions we kept taking, as we went along. Series A was very interesting. I moved to the US pre-Series A, and our first term sheet came on 19th of March 2020. So, guess what? I think 21st or 22nd, we shut down the country. And, it was a very, very interesting, journey from there, raising our A. And, once you raise your A, things become much simpler because you have a little bit more capital. We had 15 people or 17 people all put together in the company before we shut down on 19th of March. And, from there, we've just grown incredibly fast, both in terms of revenue, in terms of product market fit, and anything else. I think all the points that Umesh was mentioning about reestablishing product market fit, being the face of the company, making sure that others can recognize, empathize with you, and believe in your mission to join the company. I think nobody else can be a better salesman than the founder of the company. Mm-hmm. Over a period of time, your job is to transition that passion into as many senior folks as you have on your team, but you still have to retain the candlestick and say that here's the vision, here's the North Star, and let's marching towards that. In the last 2 years, we've hired for each of the functions, but primarily GTM. GTM functions are really important. Getting the right head of sales, getting the right head of marketing, getting the right, head of customer success. I think those 3 things are really important. And, given, and this is, by the way, assuming that, your tech is sorted. If your tech is sorted, then, you've got to basically fix up all of these 3 things. But the learnings, from there on, of course, have been that your product is never going to be complete. And therefore, initial part is all vision selling, making sure that the vision that you're selling to your customers, you're able to deliver to that vision. Because if you're not doing that, then you carry a reputational risk and the market will not forgive you for that. So I think making sure that you only promise what you can deliver is really important. It goes without saying that the US market only works on an iPhone. Your product has to be as slick and as good as the iPhone experience. It has to be, perfect. Less than perfect, you'll make some money, but you won't build a large ARR machine. And then focusing on what is repeatable and what is not, and sifting through that haystack very early, I think that really helps.
Great, great. And about team building, building the senior leadership, have you had any challenges? How have you overcome? What are the learnings that you can share with others?
Yeah, I mean, if you're basically, I had the fortune of some network here prior to, coming over here. But if you're just coming in, I think it's really useful to find what kind of company that you want to run. Because what you'll find out very soon as a founder, and I'm sure many of us have found this, is that the companies become 2 or 3 different companies based on whether you're in the US or you're in India or whether you're in Singapore. So I think the first and foremost thing is identifying with the common cultural traits. If the senior leadership does not believe in values that you uphold and the values that are the most dear to you, I don't think you should make a hire. That's the most important thing. And then, capability, of course.
So I'll do a plug for USISPF here. Here's the power of the network. We've all made hiring mistakes, and several times. Sometimes engineers need a few patterns to learn from each other. So last week, I woke up early in the morning and I had a text from Rohit, and he said, "I'm in India, call me as soon as you wake up." I was like, "Is everything okay?" That's my first text out of bed. And he said, "Yeah, the list of people I need to let go is very long." I need to talk to you about prioritization and how you did it. So I gave him a call. And he's experiencing what I experienced, which is when you move your headquarters from India to the US, two different cultures start to evolve, right? And how do you get those two cultures together? How do you still get the team together? That's a big transition for US-India startups. And the fact that some of us have made the mistakes, the next generation of entrepreneurs don't need to make the same mistakes, and we can share with each other. That's the power of the Startup Connect program.
And so likewise, if you just follow this chain, Umesh is probably 2 stages ahead of us as a company and both as an individual. There are many others who are raising their seed, and they actually call us just to ask, what do you think of this investor? And it's incredibly useful for them to just get validation that, yeah, this fund is good. So I think, from a community standpoint, that's all that we can do.
You're probably sending them all to Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I always talk good
John,
about him.
I thought that is a topic we will not get into, Rohit, but that's okay. That's great. And I would also add, if next time you're talking to entrepreneurs, also culturally, speaking of the difference in culture, the emphasis on legal documentation and where we are hiring in India, for example, it's a lot of verbal or friendly conversations. But here people do take it much more seriously. It's happening in India as well, but the ability to enforce, and if you get something wrong in the documents or the terms, the pain it causes or the potential legal or expensive sort of implications of having to let go people with the wrong terms, especially when it relates to stock ownership options, the emphasis on that is stronger here because you'll have to deal with it and you'll have to report to your board members on why you signed or agreed to whatever you did. So emphasizing or paying more attention to, as a founder, you have no excuse, right? You have to be able to understand and sign up for what you're agreeing to. Nirav, let's turn to you. Let's turn to you about your personal journey, and in your case, also because Mahindra is always seen as a very strong services company, the transition into also competing with, and being repositioned in the US, especially as a product company competing and developing a business around that, plus your personal journey. When did you move? How is it going? Your learnings, your mistakes, all of that.
Yeah, I think I will, before I go into that, I just want to making one comment on what Rohit just said, right? About the whole idea of trying to think about talent hiring in the US and also sort of having the right incentive compensation models. I mean, I think that's one of the first things that we did a couple of years ago when I just sort of started taking over this place in this business, right? I've been here multiple stints in the US. Personally, the last 8 years we've been here since 13. But in the last 2 years, we have completely revamped our entire equity compensation strategy for our leadership. We've hired almost 80% of my direct reports new in the US, and I think goes back to the point that Umesh was saying, that investing early and being bold about your talent cost and not looking at that as a cost item, as an investment for the future in terms of how you're shaping your business, that to me has been a biggest learning for us. And so, being very open to the idea, because every time you hire a new leader, they come from a slightly different background and they always have different compensation strategies that they are familiar with. Being open to those ideas, bringing your board in a conversation to really having this single point that, hey, you want to bring somebody on board, and the cost of bringing somebody on board means maybe even tweaking our stock options plans and strategies. We've done that. We've actually done that to really accommodate, saying, hey, maybe there are a set of people that are more leaning towards cash as against equity and so forth. So having these various options are very, very fundamentally important. I think the other point that I would say is, for us, the learning, as we have thought about it, that we have a huge engineering innovation R&D center out in Bangalore. That's where a lot of our supply chain tech gets built out in terms of how we're thinking about it. Now, increasingly, a lot of our leadership is over-invested here because the go-to-market, thinking about the two biggest problems that most of our clients face is around adoption and scaling. And so adoption and scaling is really where your pressure testing happens of what you built from an innovation standpoint. And so the first thing for us in that scenario is to how do you really think about your commercial model, how do you think about your marketing strategies, to think about that adoption part, and then the scaling elements come with it, saying, hey, there are some products and some features that you feel are hitting very well with your customers, there are some that you felt that were fantastic, and the fail fast strategy has to be applied to say that, hey, maybe that is really not selling in the market. So to me, the real experience for us has been pressure testing and actually taking those experiences in innovation and sort of trying to say that how quick can you be in your adoption and scaling, and how fast can you be about doing that. So in some form, if you really do enough to invest early in the innovation, but then very quickly get on to this idea of trying to over-invest in leadership in closer to where your clients are, I think is a very, very important learning in my opinion. And I think to me, that really, when the rubber hits the road, tells you whether what aspects of your innovation are really working with your clients and what aspects are really not working with your clients, that you might want to think a different strategy to dial down. So to me, I think that's been a fantastic experience for us. I mean, as I think about the network around, startup panels and so forth are fantastic in looking at product market fits, like Umesh was saying, thinking about that and investing in leadership to really testing them out and not being afraid of shutting something down if that's really not finding relevance with your client is actually a very important thing.
Great. I guess this is for all of you, but as you build your teams in India and US, do you still get a sticker shock when you're looking at India? How are you balancing that? And for the audience, for them, sort of for everyone's education, what is the delta between hiring an engineer in India versus in Bangalore, let's say, the top of the pyramid, and someone in Silicon Valley? What do you think right now is like a 25%, 50% difference, cash, equity? Do you have thoughts that you can share?
Well, for the best ones, there's hardly any difference anymore.
Really?
Yeah. So, you have to look at it from a different lens now. And the lens is not of geography, the lens is of capability. And, for the most capable engineers, we are at this point in time fighting battles with public companies, which, fill the whole house with so much stock that we can't compete. But, we still try our best, through equity. And people who actually, it's also a very self-selecting process. So if you were to just think of what the question really means, is the question is, can you be competitive from a talent point of view in different markets? And I think then the question is, what is it that you're offering to people who are looking to work with you? And if the option is, money A versus money B, then, of course, money A will win. But then if money B has a potential of rising, and if the person is interested in working in a startup for a long term, and they want to go through that journey so that eventually one day they can start their own companies, I think it becomes easier. It also depends upon, for example, for us, we are a deep tech company, writing or maintaining one API or building a company which is completely non-differentiated from the next door competitor. If that's the intent, you're not the best person for us. We are solving some really complicated problems. And in that case, certain amount of engineering talent automatically attracts or gravitates towards us. And I think we have to be very careful as to who we want to work with, because any wrong hire at a senior level can cost you a year.
Nirav, Umesh, wanna?
So, 10 years ago, I remember the cost differential an engineer in India used to be a third of the cost of Silicon Valley. Rohit is right, that differential is no longer existent, especially on skill sets like data science or AI. I'd say whether it's Silicon Valley, Tel Aviv, Spain, India, as long as you're looking for a specific skill set, the cost has nearly come similar. Now, there are some engineering skills where you might still get an arbitrage in India, but that arbitrage is probably about 25%, not more than that. And for most companies, including ours, at now 800, 900 people, for us, we don't look at these as cost arbitrage centers. We look at these as talent hubs, right? So we have some products being made in Silicon Valley. We have some products being made in Tel Aviv. We have some products being made in India and some in Europe. And so it's really about talent diversity. This is one of the last couple of years have been one of the toughest talent markets that any of us have faced. The great resignation started to happen on top of it. And so going into talent pools wherever they are, as opposed to sitting here and making a strategy that because that's cheap, I'll go there, et cetera. I think the game has shifted dramatically.
25 years ago, when I went to law school, I thought that was the right decision. I guess I should have been the engineer, even in India. Nirav, do you have thoughts to share?
I mean, look, completely resonate with the points shared here. I think in an increasingly virtual world, talent does not want to think any lesser important just because you're in some part of the world. I think the tech talent is going to continuously demand sort of fair pays, competitive pays, and in an increasingly virtual world, you're dealing with a situation where you're saying, why should a location matter? I mean, I'm equally important, irrespective of where I'm based. I should be getting what I'm worth for in terms of the impact I can create for you as a company and for your customers. So I think if you carry that approach, then you really say that, okay, technology talent is hard to find no matter where you are in the world. And then you don't negotiate the price based on purely locations or cost of living, because gone are the days where you're just sort of trying to pay the salary for cost of living. I mean, that's really not the way your compensation strategies work. I think the way to really think about it is that the value and the impact that an individual can create, irrespective of their base location, and that impact you can capture meaningfully in your business and for your clients, I think is the right way to think about the strategy, and which is partly causing, in my opinion, this uproar saying that the cost of inflation is obviously hitting everywhere, no two ways about it, and that needs to be very, very controlled and contained. But I think as far as the technology talent is concerned, we are now seeing a flatness where location, whether it is US, India, or even I would say a Silicon Valley or some far place even within the US or in India, a talent will demand that high price, irrespective of where your base location is. So I think it's a very interesting problem for a lot of people, and HR folks in particular, to think, what is your talent and compensation strategy? And I don't feel there's an easy answer to that, because you always go back and say, and from our standpoint, we're saying we're going to go operate in a fairly virtual world, which means we're going to pay people what they actually are deserving from an impact, irrespective of where their location is.
That's very interesting learnings.
Yeah, there is some reality to this as well, which will catch up in the next year. But at this point in time, many large, privately funded companies, they've actually systematically bought back shares, right? Mm-hmm. So there's like an ESOP buyback plan, and that actually just puts you out of the market from that talent. It just severs your connections. So I think these are board level conversations that we've had, in the past as well. And I think the key answer to that is, just like you're thinking about GTM leadership in the US and you're trying to install the best people, in the functions, you have to think about equally well for your engineering. Because, if you don't have the product R&D leadership, no matter where you're doing it from, I think you're anyway toast in the next few years. So there's no point in being penny wise and pound foolish.
So flipping that question somewhat, are you getting pressure from your boards to start building the next level of your teams outside of Silicon Valley, within the US, in places like St. Louis or, God forbid, Texas or somewhere else? Is that some pressure that you're getting to do that for cost arbitrage, or the number of people that are available, or the competitive nature of Silicon Valley? Is that a real thing?
Well, to be honest, we've not had any pressure, because we're still small. If we were like 1,000 people company, I'm sure that the board would look at costs from okay, let's move this function to a different geography, but we've not actually hit those numbers. And I don't think we'll actually solve for that problem. I think we'll continue to solve for the right talent.
Makes sense. Nirav, you are in Texas, so and do you see yourself competing with talent?
I was going to say that you've not heard of the great move to Dallas. So I think that's another thing that's happening with the Texas transition.
How's Elon Musk working out for you?
Well, I would say that, look, from our standpoint, we're, like I said, we're going in a fairly virtual world. We will have what we call offices all around the US, but we will also have people in a lot more places than offices where we have. So you're in a model where we are basically saying, cost of living is relevant, important, but I'm also finding people who want to live on the mountains and still work. Mm-hmm. So how do you really support that? So you're going to have to kind of find a common ground that at some point you're going to have to make a call saying, do you solve for the right talent, or do you solve for cost and location? And that's a very balancing and delicate act. And a lot of times people, if they have some working relationships, they know the person's value, they will solve for talent first. And they'll say, I don't care, he or she works in some part that she wants to be or he wants to be, right? So then you would just sort of go forward with it. So I think, in my opinion, to his point, it comes to some point where the scale is important, then the scale comes in, and then you start to really say, how do you solve? And in my opinion, the people tend to find that polarization closer to their education hubs, their graduation hubs, and so forth. So if you go closer to where the talent hubs are, then you will actually be able to meaningfully solve for scale and solve slightly differently for your leadership in a fairly global form.
Great, thanks for that. I mean, we're almost out of time. I do want to ask one last question. As you guys become the rock stars, the next rock stars of the startup ecosystem, You're also getting solicited by other entrepreneurs in India who are going to make the journey. You're also angel investing, advising, mentoring. For the audience here that would also like to participate in sort of advising for startups there or just getting sort of involved in the process, what are the areas? What are you seeing in India, areas in India, or how does someone here evaluate what's happening in India and decide to participate? What are the key learnings or mistakes, if you will, that you've made in sort of getting connected to some of the companies? And John probably has some stories to share as well. But I'd love to sort of hear from you. You are on the front lines of getting information or solicitation from these startup founders in India. What are you seeing, and what are the things that people here can learn from your experiences?
Yeah, so I mean, B2C for the last 10 years, I think, in India, it's taken off in a really big way. I think if you look at the fintech revolution and what kind of companies, have come out of that, I think Paytm, PhonePe, BharatPe until more recently, these companies are incredible. We work with PhonePe. They processed $760 billion last year on peer-to-peer transactions. And if you just think of, what ended up happening, $765 billion on the back of, $3.5 trillion of Indian economy. So they processed close to about 18% of the overall transaction in the country. So if you are able to find or identify opportunities which have these large pervasive appeal and day-to-day utilities, I think, those are excellent companies to get involved with, because these companies will become the backbone of the overall, behaviors of people, because that is how people are now transacting through their mobile apps, peer-to-peer transactions. So I think that's an interesting space. E-commerce, I think the first wave is done. The second wave is now coming up. I don't know what shape or form will that take. My own expertise is B2B SaaS, so I am not an expert by any means. Talk to Dev, who's here, who's invested in many B2C companies. But I would say that, anything which is addressing a large enough market, I think it's a pretty good market, especially given that telecom has really taken up or taken off in a big way. I think there are many opportunities over there. From a B2B SaaS point of view, I think the engineering of the previous generation, which used to work for several MNCs, or service companies or expertise in certain domains, whether it's a Salesforce, Slack, or different communication platforms, that's coming in a big way. So the kind of solutions that you'll start seeing in B2B SaaS enablement, selling, or deep tech itself, including networking, which used to be in the past. I think a lot of SDN networks are going to come out from India again. There's a lot of data companies. I just met a bunch of founders the other day. They believe that they are building the next Snowflake killer. And we looked at, how they've gone about approaching, writing queries fundamentally. And it was so exciting to see that there are people who are as passionate as us, in the data space.
Those are my friends. That's great.
Yeah, you would
to hear good words about them. Yes.
Oh, they were amazing.
Great.
So it's incredible. So I think, there are some areas of impact that we can identify.
Nirav?
Yeah, I was just going to talk a little bit about supply chain. Like last year, if you look at the US, over $32 billion was invested VC money in over 827 companies, just in North America, right? And what you're seeing now in supply chain, just talking about secular trends, and I think, we are a big believer in this space, and what you're trying to solve in supply chain is not a next 12, 48 months kind of thing. You're sort of going beyond. It's the next decade of shift that's happening. So we're pretty excited with this space. Clearly, a lot of capital going in this. Just to give you a sense, the applicability of AI and ML technologies within the supply chain world is under 30% today. And that's expected to be going over 80%. So you really look at the need for that technology being available to solve core industry problems is huge and phenomenal. And so I would always encourage that today, as we are working with a lot of supply chain tech startups in India, many of their CEOs are sort of, I call the CEO migration that's happening in the US. I think if we can collectively find ways to really help them scale faster, adopt more through the startup panel setup we have here is a huge opportunity, because there's a lot more room for us to support that ecosystem that is becoming increasingly flat, because innovation happens in one place, but the market is in a slightly different place. How can we really tie that together to help them? The big cause is a huge opportunity.
Closing thoughts?
In addition to everything that's being said, one thing I've been very excited about in the last year or so is Rohit mentioned that the engineering talent from big tech companies like Cisco, who set up offices in India, those people becoming entrepreneurs. What's beginning to happen is alumni of this new startup wave, people out of Freshworks, people out of Uniphore, are beginning to found and create companies in very exciting areas. Now, this is a fresh new talent that never existed in the Indian ecosystem. This is a talent that has gotten exposed to scaling companies on a global scale. Freshworks talent has gotten exposed to listing on NASDAQ. And so, when I moved to the US 5 years ago, there were the number of CFOs in India who had experience of listing on NASDAQ could be counted on one palm. Now that number is growing up because of the startups scaling and succeeding. So this new wave of talent coming out of existing scaled up unicorns and startups, that's very exciting. I'd say anyone interested, the way to get plugged into the Indian ecosystem, there are lots of ecosystems forming in India. One of them is SaaS Boomi. It's a for entrepreneur, by entrepreneur movement. It's especially dedicated to B2B SaaS. We have, last count, over 10,000 founders who wanted to attend a conference. We ran out of physical space in a ballroom to let them in. So that's the number of next generation B2B SaaS founders in India for whom US or developed markets like North America and Europe are the big GTM. And that's the next accelerated wave of founders that we are going to see.
Thank you all. We could continue all day, but I know Vinod is waiting. I don't want to make him angry, and he's already late. So we will sort of summarize and close the panel, thanking each of you, and also final thoughts. There's a lot happening in India. There's a lot happening here. We are here in this group because we're all able to participate, and that's exciting. At USISPF Startup, that's the sole purpose of our sort of being now. As Rohit mentioned, I introduced him to Vishnu. He's talking to Vishnu. Hopefully, we'll become a mentor to Vishnu. Maybe we'll introduce him to an investor like John, and it's a win for everyone, right? And that's what we are doing. So I would solicit and encourage all of you to start thinking about how you can participate with us. We're having a lot of fun doing this. And thanks again for coming today. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.